When I first arrived in Brownwood, Texas, deep in the heart of Texas, about 3 hours drive southwest from Dallas, Fort Worth, the Metroplex. One of the things that I did was to listen to the advice of my missions professor at Westminster Seminary, Professor Harvey Kahn, who suggested that when we go into a community, we interview some of the leading citizens and people within the community. And so I did that, and one of the interviews that I had, I don't know why, but I had an interview with the gentleman who was in charge of the water department in Brownwood, Texas. Not the first, probably, individual you would think of interviewing, I suppose, but he was willing to talk, and I was willing to ask some questions and to listen. Now, you got to remember that Brownwood, Texas is geographically a rather flat, arid land. There's not a lot of vegetation there. Trees get up to about yay high, and that's about it. There's not much there. There's some rolling hills, and of course there are some, if I remember right, there are some oil rigs in the distance. Certainly a lot of cotton fields and that kind of thing. So I sit down with the leader of the water department and ask him about this community and his job. And it's rather interesting when you sit down with the people of Brownwood, Texas, that in contrast to the drab surroundings of the community, they have a rather colorful way of talking. It's that deep southern view of life that is so refreshing and reviving. This gentleman began talking about, and I suspect he thought I was a college student, and that I was doing a term paper on water, or perhaps I was a reporter for the paper, and so he got into quite a description of what was going on. And he began describing the competition that would develop for water within the communities all around. Water was a scarce resource in Texas. And as all these communities are experiencing growth, and at that time somewhat rapid growth, that was putting severe pressure on the water system. And so he began talking about the possibility of what he described as range wars for water, as different communities competed with one another to get water. And I have this picture of cowboys on hats and getting out on horses and going off to war to fight for well water. So that was an interesting conversation. And one of the things that I thought about following that conversation was, well, maybe I ought to name our church Living Waters Presbyterian Church. Because here we have living water, true water, in abundance, that really satisfies the human soul. Whereas the water that you get from your septic system or from your water systems, that will satisfy for a moment, but then you're going to need more water, sure. Living Waters Presbyterian Church. There's something nice about that. I ended up calling it Covenant of Peace Presbyterian Church. Oh well. Not quite the same ring. But a concern for water is not simply limited to Brownwood, Texas, but the world is competing more and more for water as the population increases. In the year 2003, the United Nations put out a report with regard to the water supply. It noted that of all the vast resources of water, and it quoted one of the poets, water everywhere, but not a drop to drink. Of the vast resources of water that are on the planet, only 2.5% of that water is drinkable, fresh water. And of that 2.5%, I think it was about 2/3 of it are locked up in glaciers, and so it's not readily available. So we are left to streams, riverbeds, aquifers, and so forth for our water supply. And with an increasing, indeed rapidly expanding population, pollution problems developing, and in their view, climate change occurring, which I would think would be melting the glaciers and providing more fresh water. Just me, but hey. That's putting more stress on water resources. And the UN was arguing for the fact that today there are about 1.5 billion people who face scarcity in terms of water. You might think of images you've seen on news of like India and other places where China as well, where you look at the water and it's filthy, and people are running around in the water, getting cleaned up, or drinking from the same. It's just nasty what's occurring in other nations. And we tend here in the United States to take our water supply for granted. Sometimes we're reminded that we need water. When there's a drought and we go through a summer and there's not a drop of water and the lawns are all brown, we are reminded how desperately we need water. We cannot survive without it. The prophet Isaiah uses the image of water and the refreshment that it provides as an image of the salvation that God provides for His people. He uses that in a way which brings a climactic close to his dramatic sermons to Ahaz and the people of Jerusalem and Judah, telling them not to put their trust in various military alliances, whether it be with Ephraim and Syria to the north, or even Assyria further north and Egypt to the south, not to put their trust in these different sources of refreshment, satisfaction, help, salvation, but to put their trust in the Lord. And in this particular sermon, which begins in the middle of the 8th chapter, as Isaiah reflects on God's provision of a remnant people, and how He will raise up a banner for them in the person of His Son, who He describes as a child, the mighty God, everlasting Father, Prince of Peace. This banner will stand up above the nations and call the people of God from their scattered, disparate places to come under His shelter and receive His care and love. Isaiah brings it all to a close here in this 12th chapter by talking about what the people will be saying. Verse 1, in that day you will say. Verse 4, in that day you will say. Interestingly, in the English language, the you comes across both senses, both singular and plural, but in the Hebrew, the first verse, it's singular, you will say individually, and then in the fourth verse, it talks in the plural form, you in general. And by doing this, I think Isaiah teaches us a couple of things here, and in some ways gives us an outline of the text that we want to consider this morning. You personally, individually, need to come and see God as your salvation. It's not something that is left out there for the general public and you just kind of go along, but you individually need to come and embrace God as your Savior. But then in the fourth verse, we rejoice in the salvation of God, that God has provided for us together as the people of God who gather for worship. And so there's this individual aspect of life before God where we individually and personally confess our faith in God. Then there is that corporate gathering of the people of God whereby we worship God, give thanks to Him, and proclaim His name to the nations of the earth. And so the effect of Christ's exaltation by His death on the cross and His gathering of the people of God from all the nations of the earth into His church is to bring them together for worship. Bring them together for fellowship. Like what we are doing here this morning. This morning, what we want to see is the banner of Jesus Christ is raised each week within the congregation of the people of God. And the cross of Christ is proclaimed with clarity and with power to gather the people of God together. It's only around the cross of Christ that a true church is formed. There are many gatherings of people in the world today, some under the name of Christian church. But there's no cross of Christ being proclaimed. At least no cross of Christ which talks about the atoning sacrifice for sin that must cover us and make us right before God.